The Chymical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, as published in The Real History of the Rosicrucians by Arthur Edward Waite in 1887. The whole Rosicrucian controversy centres in this publication, which Buell describes as a comic romance of extraordinary talent. It was first published at Strasbourg in the year 1616, but, as will be seen in the 7th chapter, it is supposed to have existed in manuscript as early as 1601 to 1602, thus antedating by a long period the other Rosicrucian books. 2 editions of a German original are preserved in the library of the British Museum, both bearing the date 1616. It was translated into English for the first time in 1690 under the title of The Hermetic Romance, or The Chymical Wedding, written in High Dutch by Christian Rosenkreuz, translated by E. Foxcroft, late Fellow of King's College in Cambridge, licensed and entered according to order, printed by A. Sowie at the Crooked Billet in Holloway Lane, Shoreditch, and sold at the Three Keys in Nag's Head Court, Gracechurch Street. It is this translation in substance that is compressed by the omission of all irrelevant matter and dispensable prolixities which I now offer to the reader. The Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosenkreuz, Anno 1459. Arcana publicata vilscunt, et gratium propagata ametunt, ergo ne margarites obgis porcis sio asino substiturne rosas. The First Book, The First Day. On an evening before Easter Day, I sat at a table and, having in my humble prayer conversed with my Creator and considered many great mysteries, whereof the Father of Lights had shown me not a few, and being now ready to prepare in my heart, together with my dear Paschal Lamb, a small unleavened, undefiled cake, all on a sudden ariseth so horrible a tempest that I imagined no other but that, through its mighty force, the bill whereon my little house was founded would fly all in pieces. But inasmuch as this and the like from the devil, who had done me many a spite, was no new thing to me, I took courage and persisted in my meditation till somebody touched me on the back, whereupon I was so hugely terrified that I durst hardly look about me, yet I showed myself as cheerful as human frailty would permit. Now the same thing still twitching me several times by the coat, I glanced back, and behold, it was a fair and glorious lady, whose garments were all sky colour, and curiously bespangled with golden stars. In her right hand she bare a trumpet of beaten gold, whereon a name was engraven which I could well read, but am forbidden as yet to reveal. In her left hand she had a great bundle of letters in all languages, which she, as I afterwards understood, was to carry into all countries. She had also large and beautiful wings, full of eyes throughout, wherewith she could mount aloft and fly swifter than any eagle. As soon as I turned about, she looked through her letters, and at length drew out a small one, which, with great reverence, she laid upon the table, and without one word departed from me. But in her mounting upward, she gave so mighty a blast of her gallant trumpet that the whole hill echoed thereof, and for a full quarter of an hour afterward I could hardly hear my own words. In so unlooked for an adventure I was at a loss how to advise myself, and therefore fell upon my knees and besought my Creator to permit nothing contrary to my eternal happiness to befall me. Whereupon, with fear and trembling, I went to the letter, which was now so heavy as almost to outweigh gold. As I was diligently viewing it, I found a little seal, whereupon was engraven a curious cross with the inscription, In hoc signo vinces. As soon as I espied this sign, I was comforted, for being ignorant that it was little acceptable and much less useful to the devil. Whereupon I tenderly opened the letter, and within it, in an azure field in golden letters, found the following verses written. This day, this, the royal wedding is. Art thou thereto by birth inclined, and unto joy by God designed? Then mayest thou to the mountain ten, whereon 3 stately temples stand, and there see all from end to end. Keep watch and ward thy self-regard, unless with diligence thou bathe, the wedding can't be harmless save. He'll damage have that here delays, let him beware to light that ways. Underneath stood sponsors and sponsor. As soon as I read this letter, I was like to have fainted away. All my hair stood on end, and cold sweat trickled down my whole body. For although I was well perceived that this was the appointed wedding whereof 7 years before I was acquainted in a bodily vision, in which I had with great earnestness attended, and which lastly, by the account and calculation of the planets, I found so to be, yet could I never foresee that it must happen under so grievous and perilous conditions. For whereas I before imagined that to be a welcome guest, I needed only to appear at the wedding, I was now directed to divine providence, of which until this time I was never certain. I also found the more I examined myself that in my head there was only grossly misunderstanding and blindness in my mysterious things, so that I was not able to comprehend even those things which lay under my feet, and which I daily conversed with, much less that I should be born to the searching out and understanding of the secrets of nature, since, in my opinion, nature might everywhere find a more virtuous disciple to whom to entrust her precious, though temporary and changeable treasures. I found also that my bodily behaviour, outward conversation, and brotherly love toward my neighbour was not duly purged and cleansed. Moreover, the tickling of the flesh manifested itself, whose affection was bent only to pomp, bravery, and worldly pride, not to the good of mankind. And I was always contriving how by this art I might in some time abundantly increase my advantage, rear stately palaces, make myself an everlasting name, and other the like carnal designs. But the obscure words concerning the 3 temples did particularly afflict me, which I was not able to make out by any after speculation. Thus, sticking between hope and fear, examining myself again and again, and finding only my own frailty and impotency, and exceedingly amazed at the aforementioned threatening, at length I betook myself to my usual course. After I had finished my most fervent prayer, I laid me down in my bed, and so perchance my good angel by the divine permission might appear, as it had formerly happened, instruct me in this affair, which, to the praise of God, did now likewise fall out. For I was yet scarce asleep when methought I, together with a numberless multitude of men, lay fettered with great chains in a dark dungeon, wherein we swarmed like bees one over another, and thus rendered each other's affliction more grievous. But although neither I nor any of the rest could see one jot, yet I continually heard one heaving himself above the other, when his chains or fetters were become ever so little lighter. Now, as I with the rest had continued a good while in this affliction, and each was still reproaching the other with his blindness and captivity, at length we heard many trumpets sounding together, and kettle drums beating so artificially thereto, that I rejoiced us even in our calamity. During this noise, the cover of a dungeon was lifted up, and a little light let down unto us. The first might truly have been discerned the bustle we kept, but all went pestle-messel, and he who perchance had too much heaved up himself was forced down again under the other's feet. In brief, each one strove to be uppermost, neither did I linger, but with my weighty fetters slipped from under the rest, and then heaved myself upon a stone. Howbeit, I was several times caught at by others, from whom, as well as I might, I guarded myself with hands and feet. We imagined that we should all be set at liberty, which yet fell out quite otherwise, for after the nobles who looked upon us through the hole and recreated themselves with our struggling, a certain hoary-headed man called to us to be quiet, and having obtained it, began thus to say on: If wretched mortals would forbear themselves to be uphold, then sure on them much good confer. My righteous mother would, but since the same will not ensue, they must in care and sorrow rue, and still in prison lie. Howbeit, my dear mother will their follies oversee, her choicest goods permitting still too much in light to be. Wherefore, in honour of the feast, we this day solemnize, that so her grace may be increased, a good deed she'll devise. For now a cord shall be let down, and whosoever can hang thereon shall freely be released. He had scarce done speaking when an antient matron commanded her servants to let down the cord 7 times into the dungeon, and draw up whomsoever could hang upon it. Good God, that I could sufficiently describe the hurry that arose amongst us. Everyone strove to reach the cord, and only hindered each other. After 7 minutes a little bell rang, whereupon at the first pull the servants drew up 4. At each time I could not come near the cord, having to my huge misfortune betaken myself to the stone at the wall, whereas the cord descended in the middle. The cord was let down the 2nd time, but divers, because their chains were too heavy and their hands too tender, could not keep hold on it, and brought down others who else might have held on fast enough. Nay, many were forcibly pulled off by those who could not themselves get at it, so envious were we even in this misery. But they of all most moved by compassion, whose weight was so heavy that they tore their hands from their bodies, and yet could not get up. Thus it came to pass that at these 5 times very few were drawn up. For, as soon as the sign was given, the servants were so nimble at the draught that the most part tumbled one upon another. Whereupon the greatest part, and even myself, despaired of redemption, and called upon God to have pity on us, and deliver us out of this obscurity, who also heard some of us. For when the cord came down the 6th time, some hung themselves fast upon it, and whilst it swung from one side to the other, it came to me, which I suddenly catching, got uppermost, and so beyond all hope carve out. Whereat I exceedingly rejoiced, perceiving not the wound which in the drawing up I received on my head by a sharp stone, till I, with the rest of the released, as was always before done, was fain to help at the 7th and last pull, at which, through straining, the blood ran down my clothes. This nevertheless, through joy, I regarded not. When the last draught, whereon the most of all hung, was finished, the matron caused the cord to be laid away, and willed her aged son to declare her resolution to the rest of the prisoners, who thus spoke unto them. Ye children dear, all present here, what is but now complete and done, was long before resolved on. Whatever my mother of great grace to each on both sides here have shown, may never discontent misplace. The joyful time is drawing on, when every one shall be equal be, none wealthy, none in penury. Whoever received great commands, have work enough to fill his hands. Whoever with much hath trusted been, 'tis well if he may save his skin. Wherefore your lamentations cease. What is to wait for some few days? The cover was now again put to and locked. The trumpets and kettle drums began afresh, yet the bitter lamentations of the prisoners was heard above all, and soon caused my eyes to run over. Presently, the antient matron, together with her son, sat down and commanded the redeemed should be told. As soon as she had written down their number in a gold yellow tablet, she demanded everyone's name. This was also written down by a little page. Having viewed us all, she sighed and said to her son, how hardly am I grieved for the poor men in the dungeon. I would to God I durst release them all. Whereunto her son replied, Mother, it is thus ordained by God, against whom we may not contend. In case we all of us were lords and were seated at table, who would there be to bring up the service? At this, his mother held her peace, but soon after she said, Well, let these be freed from their fetters, which was presently done, and I, though among the last, could not refrain, but bowed myself before the antient matron, thanking God, and through her had graciously vouchsafed to bring me out of darkness into light. The rest did likewise to the satisfaction of the matron. Lastly, to everyone was given a piece of gold for a remembrance, and to spend by the way. On the one side thereof was stamped the rising sun, and on the other these 3 letters, D.L.S. Therewith all had license to depart to his own business, with this intimation, that we, to the glory of God, should benefit our neighbours, and reserve in silence what we had been entrusted with. Which we promised to do, and departed one from another. Because of the wounds the fetters had caused me, I could not well go forward, which the matron presently espying, calling me again to her side, said to me, My son, let not this defect afflict thee, but call to mind thy infirmities, and thank God, who hath permitted thee, even in this world, to come into so high a light. Keep these wounds for my sake. Whereupon the trumpets began again to sound, which so affrighted me that I awoke, and perceived that it was only a dream, which yet was so impressed on my imagination that I was perpetually troubled about it, and methought I was still sensible of the wounds on my feet. By all these things I well understood that God had vouchsafed me to the present at this mysterious and hidden wedding. Wherefore, with childlike confidence, I returned thanks to his divine majesty, and besought him that he would preserve me in his fear, daily fill my heart with wisdom and understanding, and graciously conduct me to the desired end. Thereupon I prepared myself for the way, put on my white linen coat, girded my loins with a blood-red ribbon bound crossways over my shoulders. In my hat I stuck 4 red roses, which I might the sooner by this token be taken notice of amongst the throng. For food I took bread, salt, and water, which by the counsel of an understanding person I had at certain times used, not without profit, in the like occurrences. Before I parted from my cottage, I first, in this my wedding garment, fell down upon my knees and besought God to vouchsafe me a good issue. I made a vow that if anything should by his grace be revealed to me, I would employ it neither to my own honour nor authority in the world, but to the spreading of his name and the service of my neighbour. With this vow I departed out of my cell with joy. The second day. I was hardly got out of my cell into a forest, when methought the whole heaven and all the elements had trimmed themselves against this wedding. Even the birds chanted more pleasantly than before, and the young fawns skipped so merrily that they rejoiced my old heart, and moved me also to sing with such a loud voice throughout the whole forest that it resounded from all parts, the hills repeating my last words, until at length I espied a curious green heath, whither I betook myself out of the forest. Upon this heath stood 3 tall cedars, which afforded an excellent shade, whereat I greatly rejoiced, for, although I had not gone far, my earnest longing made me faint. As soon as I came somewhat nigh, I espied a tablet fastened to one of them, on which the following words were written in curious letters. God save thee, stranger. If thou hast heard anything concerning the nuptials of the king, consider these words. By us doth the bridegroom offer thee a choice between 4 ways, all of which, if thou dost not sink down in the way, can bring thee to his royal court. The first is a short but dangerous, and one which will lead thee into rocky places, through which it will be scarcely possible to pass. The second is longer, and takes thee circuitously. It is plain and easy, if by the help of a magnet thou turnest neither to left nor right. The third is that truly royal way, which through various pleasures and pageants of our king affords thee a joyful journey. But this so far has scarcely been allotted to 1 in 1,000. By the 4th shall no man reach the place, because it is a consuming way, practicably only one for incorruptible bodies. Choose now which thou wilt of the 3, and persevere constantly therein, for know whichsoever thou shalt enter, that is the one destined for thee by immutable fate, nor canst thou go back therein save at great peril to life. These are the things which we would have thee know, but ho, beware, thou knowest not with how much danger thou dost commit thyself to this way, for if thou knowest thyself by the smallest fault to be obnoxious to the laws of our king, I beseech thee, while it is still possible, to return swiftly to thy house by the way which thou earnest. As soon as I had read this writing, all my joy vanished, and I, who before sang merrily, began inwardly to lament. For although I saw all 3 ways before me, and it was vouchsafed me to make choice of one, Yet it troubled me that in case I went the stony and rocky way, I might get a deadly fall, or, taking the long one, I might wander through byways and be detained in the great journey. Neither durst I hope that I, amongst thousands, should be the one who should choose the royal way. I saw likewise the fourth before me, but so environed with fire and exhalation that I durst not draw near it, and therefore again and again considered whether I should turn back or take one of the ways before me. I well weighed my own unworthiness, and though the dream that I was delivered out of a tower still comforted me, yet I durst not confidently rely upon it. I was so perplexed that, for great weariness, hunger, and thirst seized me, whereupon I drew out my bread, cut a slice of it, with a snow-white dove of whom I was not aware, sitting upon the tree, espied, and therewith came down, betaking herself very familiarly to me, to whom I willingly imparted my food, which she received, and with her prettiness did again a little refresh me. But as soon as her enemy, a most black raven, perceived it, he straight darted down upon the dove, and taking no notice of me, would needs force away her meat, who would not otherwise guard herself but by flight. Whereupon both together flew toward the south, at which I was so hugely incensed and grieved, that without thinking I made haste after the filthy raven, and so, against my will, ran into one of the forementioned ways a whole field's length. The raven being thus chased away, and the dove delivered, I first observed that I had inconsiderately done, and that I was already entered into a way from which, under peril of punishment, I durst not retire, and though I had still wherewith to comfort myself, yet that which was worst of all was, that I had left my bag and bread at the tree, and could never retrieve them, for as soon as I turned myself about, a contrary wind was so strong against me that it was ready to fell me. But if I went forward, I perceived no hindrance. Wherefore I patiently took up my cross, got upon my feet, and resolved I would use my utmost endeavour to get to my journey's end before night. Now, although many apparent byways showed themselves, I still proceeded with my compass, and would not budge one step from the meridian line. Howbeit the way was oftentimes so rugged that I was in little doubt of it. I constantly thought upon the dove and raven, and yet could not search out the meaning, until upon a high hill afar off I espied a stately portal, to which, not regarding that it was distant from the way I was in, I hasted because the sun had already hid himself under the hills, and I could elsewhere see no abiding place, which I verily ascribe only to God, who might have permitted me to go forward, and withheld my eyes, that so I might have gazed beside this gate, to which I now made mighty haste, and reached it by so much daylight as to take a competent view of it. It was an exceeding royal, beautiful portal, whereon were carved a multitude of most noble figures and devices, every one of which, as I afterwards learned, had its peculiar signification. Above was fixed a pretty large tablet with these words, Procul hinc procul ite profani, and more that I was forbidden to relate. As soon as I was come unto the portal, there straight stepped forth one in a sky-coloured habit, whom I saluted in friendly manner. Though he thankfully returned my greeting, he instantly demanded my letter of invitation. Oh, how glad was I that I had brought it with me! How easily might I have forgotten it as chanced to others, as he himself told me! I quickly presented it, wherewith he was not only satisfied, but showed me abundance of respect, saying, Come in, my brother, an acceptable guest you are to me, withal entreating me not to withhold my name from him. Having replied that I was a brother of the red rosy cross, he both wondered and seemed to rejoice at it, and then proceeded thus, My brother, have you nothing about you wherewith to purchase a token? I answered my ability was small, but if he saw anything about me he had a mind to, it was at his service. Having requested of me my bottle of water, and I granting it, he gave me a golden token, whereon stood these letters, S.C., entreating me that when it stood me in good stead, I would remember him. After which I asked him how many were got in before me, which he also told me, and lastly, out of mere friendship, gave me a sealed letter to the second porter. Having lingered some time with him, the night grew on, whereupon a great beacon upon the gate was immediately fired, that if any was still upon the way, he might make haste thither. The road where it finished at the castle was enclosed with walls and planted with all sorts of excellent fruit trees. On every third tree on each side lanterns were hung up, wherein all the candles were lighted with a glorious torch by a beautiful virgin, habited in sky colour, which was so noble and majestic a spectacle that I delayed longer than was requisite. At length, after an advantageous instruction, I departed from the first porter, and so went on the way until I came to the second gate, which was adorned with images and mystic significations. In the affixed tablet stood Date et dabitur volus. Under this gate lay a terrible lion, chained, who as soon as he espied me, arose and made at me with great roaring, whereupon the second porter, who lay upon a stone of marble, awaked, and wished me not to be troubled nor frightened, drove back the lion, and having received the letter which I reached him with trembling hand, he read it, and with great respect spake thus to me: Now well, come, in God's name, unto me the man whom of long time I would gladly have seen. Meanwhile, he also drew out a token, and asked me whether I could purchase it. But I, having nothing else left but my salt, presented it to him, which he thankfully accepted. Upon this token again stood 2 letters, namely S.M. Being just about to discourse with him, it began to ring in the castle, whereupon the porter counselled me to run apace, or all the pains I had taken would serve to no purpose, for the lights above began already to be extinguished, whereupon I dispatched with much haste, that I needed not the porter. The virgin, after whom all the lights were put out, was at my heels, and I should never have found the way, had not she with her torch afforded me some light. I was moreover constrained to enter the very next to her, and the gates were so suddenly clapped to that a part of my coat was locked out, which I was forced to leave behind me, for neither I nor they who stood ready without and called at the gate could prevail with the porter to open it again. He delivered the keys to the virgin, who took them with her into the court. I again surveyed the gate, which now appeared so rich that the world could not equal it. Just by the door were 2 columns, on one of which stood a pleasant figure with this inscription, Congratulator. On the other side was a statue, with countenance veiled, and beneath was written Condaleo. In brief, the inscriptions and figures thereon were so dark and mysterious that the most dexterous man could not have expounded them, yet all these I shall ever long publish and explain. Under this gate I was again to give my name, which was written down in a little vellum book, and immediately were the rest dispatched to the Lord Bridegroom. Here I first received the true guest token, which was somewhat less than the former, but much heavier. Upon this stood the letters S, P, N. Beside this, a new pair of shoes were given me, for the floor of the castle was pure shining marble. My old ones I was to give to one of the poor who sat in throngs under the gate. I bestowed them on an old man, after which 2 pages, with as many torches, conducted me into a little room, where they willed me to sit down upon a form, and sticking their torches in 2 holes made in the pavement, they departed, and left me sitting alone. Soon after I heard a noise, but saw nothing. It proved to be certain men who stumbled in upon me, but since I could see nothing, I was fain to suffer and attend what they would do with me. Presently finding that they were barbers, I entreated them not to jostle me, for I was content to do what they desired, whereupon one of them, whom I yet could not see, gently cut away the hair from the crown of my head, and on my forehead, ears, and eyes he permitted my ice-grey locks to hang. In this first encounter, I was ready to despair, for inasmuch as some of them shoved me so forcibly and were still invisible, I could only think that God, for my curiosity, had suffered me to miscarry. The unseen barbers carefully gathered up the hair which was cut off and carried it away. Then the two pages re-scented and heartily laughed at me for being so terrified. They had scarce spoken a few words with me, when again a little bell began to ring, which, as the pages informed me, was to give notice for assembling. Whereupon they willed me to rise, and through many walks, doors, and winding stairs, lighted me into a spacious hall, where there was a great multitude of guests, emperors, kings, princes, and lords, noble and ignoble, rich and poor, and all sorts of people, at which I hugely marvelled, and thought to myself, "Ah, how gross a fool hast thou been to engage upon this journey with so much bitterness and toil, when here are fellows whom thou well knowest, and yet hadst never reason to esteem, while thou, with all thy prayers and supplications, art hardly got in at last." This and more the devil at the time injected. Meantime, one or more of my acquaintances spoke to me. "Oh, brother Rosenkreutz, art thou here too?" "Yea, my brother," I replied. "The grace of God hath helped me in also," at which they raised a mighty laughter, looking upon it as ridiculous that there should be need of God in so slight an occasion. Having demanded each of them concerning this way, and finding most of them were forced to clamber over the rocks, certain invisible trumpets began to sound to the table, whereupon all seated themselves, every one as he judged himself above the rest, so that for me and some other sorry fellows there was hardly a little nook left at the lowermost table. Presently the two pages entered, and one of them said grace in so handsome and excellent a manner as rejoiced the very heart in my body. Howbeit some made but little reckoning of them, but flared and winked one at another, biting their lips within their hats, and using like unseemly gestures. After this, meat was brought in, and albeit none could be seen, everything was so orderly managed that it seemed as if every guest had his proper attendant. Now my artists, having somewhat recruited themselves, and the wine having a little removed shame from their hearts, they presently began to vaunt their abilities. One would prove this, another that, and commonly the most sorry idiots made the loudest noise. When I call to mind what preternatural and impossible enterprises I then heard, I am still ready to vomit at it. In fine, they never kept in their order, but whenever possible a rascal would insinuate himself among the nobles. Every man had his own plate, and yet the great lords were so simple that they believed their pretences, and the rogues became so audacious that although some of them were rapped over the fingers with a knife, yet they flinched not at it. And when any one perchance had filched a gold chain, then would all hazard for the like. I saw one who heard the movements of the heavens, the second could see Plato's ideas, a third could remember the atoms of Democritus. There were not a few pretenders to perpetual motion. Many an one, in my opinion, had good understanding, but assumed too much to himself to his own destruction. Lastly, there was one who would needs persuade us that he saw the servitors who attended, and could have pursued his contention, but not one of those invisible waiters reached him so handsome a cuff upon his lying muzzle. But not only he, but many who were by him, became mute as mice. It best of all pleased me that those of whom I had any esteem were very quiet in their business, acknowledging themselves to be misunderstanding men for whom the mysteries of nature were too high. In this tumult I had almost cursed the day wherein I came hither, for I could not but with anguish behold that those lewd people were above at the board, but I in my sorry place could not even rest in quiet. One of these rascals scornfully reproaching me for a motley fool. I dreamed not that there was one gate behind though which we must pass, but imagined during the whole wedding I was to continue in this scorn and indignity which I had no time deserved, either of the Lord bridegroom or the bride, and therefore I pined he would have done well to seek some other fool than me for his wedding. To such impatience does the iniquity of this world reduce simple hearts, but this was really one part of the lameness whereof I had dreamed. The longer all this clamour lasted, the more it increased. Howbeit there sat by me a very fine, quiet man, who discoursed of excellent matters, and at length said, My brother, if any one should come now who were willing to instruct these blockish people in the right way, would he be heard? No, verily, I replied. The world, said he, is now resolved to be cheated, and will give no ear to those who intend its good. Seest thou that coxcomb, with that whimsical figures and foolish conceits he allures others? There one makes mouths at the people with unheard-of mysterious words, yet the time is now coming when those shameful wizards shall be plucked off, and the world shall know what vagabond impostors were concealed behind them. Then perhaps that will be valued, which at present is not esteemed. While he was thus speaking, and the clamour was still increasing, all on a sudden there began in the hall such excellent and stately music of which, all the days of my life, I never heard the like. Everyone held his peace and attended what would come of it. There were all stringed instruments imaginable, sounding together in such harmony that I forgot myself, and sat so unmovable that those by me were amazed. This lasted nearly half an hour, wherein none of us spoke one word, for as soon as anyone was about to open his mouth, he got an unexpected blow. After that space, this music ceased suddenly, and presently before the door of the hall began a great sounding and beating of trumpets, shalms, and kettle drums, all so master-like as if the Emperor of Rome had been entering. The door opened of itself, and then the noise of the trumpets was so loud that we were hardly able to endure it. Meanwhile, many thousand small tapers came into the hall, marching of themselves in so exact an order as amazed us, till, at last, the two forementioned pages with bright torches entered, lighting in a most beautiful virgin, drawn on a gloriously gilded, triumphant, self-moving throne. She seemed to me the same who on the way kindled and put out the lights, and that these her attendants were the very ones whom she formerly placed at the trees. She was not now in sky colour, but in snow white, glittering robe which sparkled of pure gold, and cast such a lustre that we durst not steadily behold it. Both the pages were after the same manner habited, albeit somewhat more slightly. As soon as they were come into the middle of the hall, and were descended upon the throne, all the small tapers made obeisance before her, whereupon we all stood up, and she having to us, as we again to her, showed all respect and reverence in a most pleasant tone, she began to speak. The king, my lord, most gracious, and now's not very far from us, as also his most lovely bride, to him in troth and honour tied, already with great joy imbued, have you arrived hither viewed, and do not every one and all promise their grace in special, and from their very heart's desire, you may the same in time acquire, that so their future nuptial joy may mixed he with none's annoy. Hereupon, with all her small tapers, she again courteously bowed, and presently began thus. In the invitation writ you know, that no man called was hereto, who of God's rarest gifts good store had not received long before. Although we cannot well conceit that any man so desperate, under conditions so hard, here to intrude without regard, unless he have been, first of all, prepared for this nuptial, and therefore in good hopes do dwell, that with all you it will be well. Yet men are grown so bold and rude, not weighing their ineptitude, as still to thrust themselves in place whereto none of them called was. No coxcomb here himself may sell, no rascal in with others still, for we resolve without all let a wedding pure to celebrate. So then the artists for to weigh, scales shall be fixed ensuring day, thereby each one may lightly find that he have left at home behind. If here be any of that rout, who have good cause themselves to doubt, let him pack quickly, hence abide, because in case he long abide, of grace forlorn and quite undone, betimes he must the gauntlet run. If any now his conscience gall, he shall tonight be left in the hall, and be again released by morn, yet so he hither never return. If any man have confidence, he with his waiter may go hence, who shall him to his chamber light, where he may rest in peace tonight. As soon as she had done speaking, she again made reverence and sprung cheerfully into her throne, after which the trumpets began again to sound and conducted her invisibly away. But the most part of the small tapers remained, and still one of them accompanied each of us. In our perturbation, 'tis scarcely possible to express what pensive thoughts and gestures were amongst us. Yet, most part resolved to weight the scale, and in case things sorted not well, to depart as they hoped in peace. I had soon cast up my reckoning, and seeing my conscience convinced me of all ignorance and unworthiness, I purposed to stay with the rest in the hall, and choose rather to content myself with the meal I had taken than to run the risk of a future repulse. After everyone by his small taper had been severely conducted to a chamber, each, as I since understood, into a peculiar one, there stayed 9 of us, including he who discoursed with me at the table. Although our small tapers left us not, yet within an hour's time one of the pages came in, and bringing a great bundle of cords with him, first demanded whether we had concluded to stay there, which, when we had with sighs affirmed, he bound each of us in several places, and so went away with our tapers, leaving us poor wretches in darkness. Then first began some to perceive the imminent danger, and myself could not refrain tears, for although we were not forbidden to speak, anguish and affliction suffered none of us to utter one word. The cords were so wonderfully made that none could cut them, much less get them off his feet. Yet this comforted me, that the future gain of many and one who had now betaken himself to rest would prove little to his satisfaction. But we, by one night's penance, might expiate all our presumption. At length, in my sorrowful thoughts, I fell asleep, during which I had a dream which I esteem not impertinent to recount. Methought I was upon a high mountain, and saw before me a great valley, wherein there gathered an unspeakable multitude, each of whom had at his head a string by which he was hanging. Now one hung high, another low. Some stood even quite upon the earth. In the air there flew up and down an ancient man, who had in his hand a pair of shears, wherewith here he cut one's and then another's thread. Now he that was nigh the earth fell without noise, but when this happened to the high ones, the earth quaked at their fall. To some it came to pass that their thread was so stretched they came to the earth before it was cut. I took pleasure at this tumbling, and it joyed me at the heart when he who had overexalted himself in the air of his wedding got so shameful a fall that it carried even some of his neighbours along with him. In like manner, it rejoiced me that he who had kept so near the earth could come down so gently that even his next men perceived it not. But in my highest fit of jollity, I was unawares jogged by one of my fellow captives, upon which I waked and was much discontented with hint. Howbeit I considered my dream, and I recounted it to my brother, who lay by me on the other side, and who hoped some comfort might thereby be intended. In such discourse we spent the remaining part of the night, and with longing expected the day. The 3rd day. As soon as the lovely day was broken, and the bright sun, having raised himself above the hills, had betaken himself to his appointed office, my good champions began to rise and leisurely make themselves ready into the inquisition. Whereupon, one after another they came again into the hall, and giving us a good morrow, demanded how we had slept. And having espied our bonds, some reproved us for being so cowardly that we had not, as they, hazarded upon all adventures. Howbeit some, whose hearts still smote them, made no loud cry of the business. We excused ourselves with our ignorance, hoping we should soon be set at liberty, and learn wit by this disgrace, that they also had not altogether escaped, and perhaps their greatest danger was still to be expected. At length, all being assembled, the trumpets began again to sound and the kettle drums to beat, and we imagined that the bridegroom was ready to present himself, which, nevertheless, was a huge mistake, For again it was the Virgin who had arrayed herself all in red velvet and girded herself with a white scarf. Upon her head she had a green wreath of laurel, which much became her. Her train was no more of small tapers, but consisted of 200 men in harness, all clothed, like herself, in red and white. As soon as they were alighted from the throne, she comes straight to us prisoners, and, after she had saluted us, said in few words, "That some of you have been sensible of your wretched condition is pleasing to my most mighty Lord, and he is also resolved you shall fare the better for it." Having espied me in my habit, she laughed and spoke. "Good lack, hast thou also submitted thyself to the yoke? I imagined that thou would have made thyself very snug," which words caused my eyes to run over. After this, she commanded we should be unbound, coupled together, and placed in a station where we might well behold the scales. "For," she said, "it may fare better with them than with the presumptuous who yet stand at liberty." Meantime the scales, which were entirely of gold, were hung up in the midst of the hall. There was also a little table covered in red velvet, and 7 weights thereon. First of all stood a pretty great one, then 4 little ones, lastly 2 great ones severally, and these weights, in proportion to their bulk, were so heavy that no man can believe or comprehend it. Each of the harnessed men carried a naked sword and a strong rope. They were distributed according to the number of weights into 7 bands, and out of every band was one chosen for their proper weight. After which the Virgin again sprung up into her high throne, and one of the pages commanded each to place himself according to his order, and successively step into the scale. One of the emperors, making no scruple, first bowed himself a little towards the Virgin, and in all his stately attire went up, whereupon each captain laid in his weight, which, to the wonder of all, he stood out. But the last was too heavy for him, so that forth he must, and that with which anguish that the Virgin herself seemed to pity him. Yet was the good emperor bound and delivered to the 6th band. Next him come forth another emperor, who stepped haughtily into the scale, and having a thick book under his gown, he imagined not to fail, but, being scarce able to abide the 3rd weight, he was unmercifully slung down, and his book in that affrightment slipped from him. All the soldiers began to laugh, and he was delivered up bound to the 3rd band. Thus it went also with some others of the emperors, who were all shamefully laughed at and made captive. After these comes forth a little short man with a curled brown beard, an emperor too, who after the usual reverence got up and held out so steadfastly that methought that there had been more weights he would have outstood them. To him the Virgin immediately arose and bowed before him, causing him to put on a gown of red velvet. Then reaching him a branch of laurel, whereof she had good store upon her throne, on the steps of which she willed him to sit down. How after him it fared with the rest of the emperors, kings, and lords would be too long to recount. Few of those great personages held out, though sundry eminent virtues were found in many. Every one who failed was miserably laughed at by the bands. After the Inquisition had passed over the gentry, the learned and unlearned, in each condition, one, it may be, two, but mostly none, being found perfect, it came to those vagabond cheaters and rascally lapidum spillifanicum makers, who were set upon the scale with such scorn, that for all my grief I was ready to burst my belly with laughing. Neither could the prisoners themselves refrain, for the most part could not abide that severe trial, but with whips and scourges were jerked out of the scale. Thus of so pert a throng, so few remained that I am ashamed to discover their number. Howbeit there were persons of quality also amongst them who, notwithstanding, were also honoured with velvet robes and wreaths of laurel. The Inquisition being finished, and none but we poor coupled hounds standing aside, one of the captains stepped forth and said, "Gracious madam, if it please your ladyship, let these poor men, who acknowledged their misunderstanding, be set upon the scale also without danger of penalty, and only for recreation's sake, if perchance anything right be found among them." At this I was in great perplexity, for in my anguish this was my only comfort, that I was not to stand in such ignominy, or be lashed out of the scale. Yet since the Virgin consented, so it must be, and we being untied were one after another set up. Now, although the most part miscarried, they were neither laughed at nor scourged, but peaceably placed on one side. My companion was the fifth, who held out bravely, whereupon all, but especially the captain who made the request for us, applauded him, and the Virgin showed him the usual respect. After him, 2 more were dispatched in an instant, but I was the 8th, and as soon as, with trembling, I stepped up, my companion, who already sat by in his velvet, looked friendly upon me, and the Virgin herself smiled a little. But forasmuch as I outstayed all the weights, the Virgin commanded them to draw me up by force, whereupon 3 men moreover hung on the other side of the beam, and yet could nothing prevail. Whereupon one of the pages immediately stood up and cried that exceedingly loud, "That is he!" Upon which the other replied, "Then let him gain his liberty," which the Virgin accorded, and being received with due ceremonies, the choice was given me to release one of the captives, whomsoever I pleased, whereupon I made no long deliberations, but elected the first emperor, whom I had long pitied, who was immediately set free, and with all respect seated among us. Now the last being set up the weights proved too heavy for him. Meanwhile the Virgin espied my roses, which I had taken out of my hat into my hands, and thereupon by her page graciously requested them of me, which I readily sent to her. And so this first act was finished about 10 in the forenoon. The trumpets again began to sound, which nevertheless we could not as yet see. Meantime the bands were to step aside with their prisoners and expect the judgment, after which a council of the 7 captains and ourselves was set, with the Virgin as president, whereat it was concluded that all the principal lords should with befitting respect be led out of the castle, that others should be stripped and caused to run out naked, while others yet with rods, whips, or dogs should be hunted out. Those who the day before willingly surrendered themselves might be suffered to depart without any blame, but those presumptuous ones, and they who had behaved themselves so unseemly at dinner, should be punished in body and life according to each man's demerit. This opinion pleased the Virgin well, and obtained the upper hand. There was moreover another dinner vouchsafed them, the execution itself being deferred till noon. Herewith the Senate arose, and the Virgin, together with her attendants, returned to her usual quarter. The uppermost table in the room was allotted to us till the business was fully dispatched, and we should be conducted to the Lord Bridegroom and Bride, with which we were well content. The prisoners were again brought into the hall, and each man seated according to his quality. They were enjoined to behave somewhat more civilly than they had done the day before, which admonishment they needed not, for they had already put up their pipes, and this I can boldly say, that commonly those who were of the highest rank best understood how to comport themselves in so unexpected a misfortune. Their treatment was but indifferent, yet with respect neither could they see their attendants, who were visible to us, whereat I was exceedingly joyful. Although fortune had exalted us, we took not upon us more than the rest, advising them to be of good cheer and comforting them as well as we could, drinking with them to try if the wine might make them cheerful. Our table was covered with red velvet, beset with drinking cups of pure silver and gold, which the rest could not behold without amazement and anguish. Before we had seated ourselves in came the 2 pages, presenting everyone in the bridegroom's behalf the golden fleece with a flying lion, requesting us to wear them at the table, and to observe the reputation and dignity of the order which His Majesty had vouchsafed us and would ratify with suitable ceremonies. This we received with the profoundest submission, promising to perform whatever his majesty should please. Beside these, the noble page had a schedule wherein we were set down in order. Now, because our entertainment was exceedingly stately, we demanded one of the pages whether we might have leave to send some choice bit to our friends and acquaintances, who, making no difficulty, everyone sent by the waiters. Howbeit the receivers saw none of them, and forasmuch as they knew not whence it came, I was myself desirous to carry somewhat to one of them, but, as soon as I was risen, one of the waiters was at my elbow, desiring me to take friendly warning, for in case one of the pages had seen it, it would come to the king's ear, who would certainly take it amiss of me. But since none had observed it save himself, he purposed not to betray me, and that I must for the time to come have better regard to the dignity of the order. With these words, the servant did really so astonish me that for long I scarce moved upon my seat. Yet I returned him thanks for his faithful warning as well as I was able. Soon after the drums began to beat, wherefore we prepared ourselves to receive the Virgin, who now came in with her train. Upon her high seat, one of the pages, bearing before her a very tall goblet of gold, and the other a patent in parchment. Being now after a marvellous artificial manner alighted from her seat, she takes the goblet from the page and presents it in the king's behalf, saying that it was brought from his majesty, and that in honour of him we should cause it to go round. Upon the cover of this goblet stood Fortune, curiously cast in gold, who had in her hand a red flying ensign, for which cause I drunk somewhat the more sadly, as having been too well acquainted with the Fortune's waywardness. For the Virgin, who also was adorned with the golden fleece and line, hereupon began to distinguish the patent which the other page held into two different parts, one of which thus much was read before the first company, that they should confess that they had too lightly given credit to false fictitious books, had assumed too much to themselves, and to come into this castle uninvited, and perhaps designing to make their markets here, and afterwards to live in the greater pride and lordliness. Thus one had seduced another, and plunged him into disgrace and ignominy. Wherefore they were deservedly to be soundly punished, all which they, with great humility, readily acknowledged, and gave their hands upon it. After which a severe check was given to the rest, much to this purpose, that they were convinced in their consciences of forging false fictitious books, had befooled and cheated others, thereby diminishing regal dignity amongst all. They knew what ungodly, deceitful figures they had made use of, not even sparing the divine Trinity. It was also clear as day with what practices they had endeavoured to ensnare their guests. In like manner, it was manifest to all the world that they wallowed in open whoredom, adultery, gluttony, and other uncleannesses. In brief, they had disparaged kingly majesty even amongst the common sort, and therefore should confess themselves to be convicted vagabond cheats and rascals, for which they deserved to be cashiered from the company of civil people and severely to be punished. The good artists were loath to come to this confession, but inasmuch as the Virgin not only herself threatened and sware their death, but the other party also vehemently raged at them, crying that they had most wickedly seduced them out of the light, they at length, to prevent a huge misfortune, confused the same with dolour, yet alleged their actions should not be animadverted upon in the worst sense. For the lords were resolved to get into the castle, and had promised great sums of money to that effect. Each one had used all craft to seize upon something, and so things were brought to the present pass. Thus they had deserved no more than the lords themselves. Their books also sold so mightily that whoever had no other means to maintain himself was fain to engage in this concernage. They hoped, moreover, they should be found no way to have miscarried, as having behaved towards the lords as became servants upon their honest entreaty. But answer was made that his royal majesty had determined to punish all, albeit one more severely than another. For although what they had alleged was partly true, and therefore the lords should not wholly be indulged, yet they had good reason to prepare themselves for death, who had so presumptuously obtruded themselves, and perhaps seduced the ignorant against their will. Thereupon many began most piteously to lament and prostrate themselves, all which could avail them nothing. And I much marvelled how the Virgin could be so resolute, when their misery caused our eyes to run over. She presently dispatched her page, who brought with him all the cuirassiers which had been appointed at the scales, who were each commanded to take his own man, and in an orderly procession conduct him into the great garden. Leave was given to my yesterday companions to go out into the garden unbound and be present at the execution of the sentence. When every man was come forth, the Virgin mounted up into her high throne, requesting us to sit down upon the steps and appear at the judgment. The goblet was committed to the page's keeping, and we went forth in our robes upon the throne, which of itself moved so gently as if we had passed in the air, till we came into the garden, where we arose all together. This garden was not extraordinarily curious, only it pleased me that the trees were planted in so good order. Besides, there ran in it a most costly fountain, adorned with wonderful figures and inscriptions and strange characters, which, God willing, I shall mention in a future book. In this garden was raised a wooden scaffold hung with curiously painted figured coverlets. There were 4 galleries made, one over another. The first was more glorious than the rest, and covered with a white taffeta curtain, so that we could not perceive who was behind it. The second was empty and uncovered, while the last 2 were draped with red and blue taffeta. As soon as we were come to the scaffold, the Virgin bowed herself down to the ground, at which we were mightily terrified, for we could easily guess that the King and Queen must not be far off. We also having duly performed our reverence, the Virgin led us by the winding stairs into the second gallery, where she placed herself uppermost, and us in our former order. But how the Emperor, whom I had released, behaved towards me, I cannot relate for fear of slander, for he might well imagine in what anguish he now should have been, and that only through me he had attained such dignity and worthiness. Meantime, the Virgin who first brought me the invitation, and whom I had hitherto never since seen, stepped in, and giving one blast upon her trumpet, declared the sentence with a very loud voice. The King's Majesty, by most gracious Lord, could from his heart wish that all here assembled had, upon his Majesty's invitation, presented themselves so qualified that they might have adjourned their nuptial joyous feast. But since it has otherwise pleased Almighty God, he has not wherewith to murmur, but is forced, contrary to his inclination, to abide by the antient and laudable constitutions of his kingdom, albeit that his Majesty's clemency may be celebrated, the usual sentence shall be considerably lenified. He vouchsafed to the lords and potentates not only their lives entirely, but also freely dismisses them, courteously entreating your lordship not to take it in evil part that you cannot be present at his feast of honour. Neither is your reputation hereby prejudiced, although you be rejected by this our order, since we cannot at once do all things, and forasmuch as your lordships have been seduced by base rascals, it shall pass unrevenged. Furthermore, his Majesty resolveth shortly to communicate with you a catalogue of heretics, or index expurgatorius, that you may with better judgment discern between good and evil. And because his Majesty also purposeth to rummage his library and offer the seductive writings to Vulcan, he courteously entreats every one of you to put the same in execution with your own, whereby it is to be hoped that all evil and mischief may be remedied. And you are admonished never henceforth to inconsiderately to covet entrance hither, lest the former excuse of seducers be taken from you. In fine, as the estates for land have still somewhat to demand of your lordships, his Majesty hopes that no man will think it much to redeem himself with a chain, or that else he have about him, and so, in friendly manner, depart from us. The others who stood not at the first, third, and fourth weight, his Majesty will not so lightly dismiss, but that they also may experience his gentleness, it is his command to strip them naked, and so send them forth. Those who in the second and fifth weight were found too light shall, besides stripping, be noted with one or more brands, according to each has lighter or heavier. They who were drawn up by the sixth or seventh shall be somewhat more graciously dealt with, and so forward, for unto every combination there is a certain punishment ordained. They who yesterday separated themselves of their own accord shall go at liberty without blame. Finally, the convicted vagabond cheats, who could move up none of the weights, shall be punished in body and life with sword, halter, water, and rods, and such execution of judgment shall be inviolably observed for an example unto others. Herewith one virgin broke her wand, the other, who read the sentence, blew her trumpet and stepped with profound reverence towards the curtain. Now this judgment being read over, the lords were well satisfied, for which cause they gave more than they were desired, each one redeeming himself with chains, jewels, gold, monies, and other things, and with reverence they took leave. Although the king's servants were forbidden to jeer any at his departure, some unlucky birds could not hold laughing, and certainly it was sufficiently ridiculous to see them pack away with such speed, without once looking behind them. At the door was given to each of them a draught of forgetfulness, that he might have no further memory of misfortune. After these the volunteers departed, who, because of their ingenuity, were suffered to pass, but so as never to return of the same fashion, albeit if to them, as likewise to the others, anything further were revealed, they should be welcome guests. Meanwhile, others were stripped, in which also an inequality according to demerit was observed. Some were sent away naked, without other hurt, others were driven out with small bells, some again were scourged forth. In brief, the punishments were so various that I am not able to recount them all. With the last, a somewhat longer time was spent, for whilst some were hanging, some beheading, some forced to leap into the water, much time was consumed. Verily, at this execution my eyes ran over, not indeed in regard of the punishment which impudency well deserved, but in contemplation of human blindness, in that we are continually busying ourselves over that which since the first fall has been sealed to us. Thus the garden which lately was quite full was soon emptied. As soon as this was done, and silence had been kept for the space of 5 minutes, there came forward a beautiful snow-white unicorn with a golden collar, engraved with certain letters about his neck. He bound himself down upon his 4 feet, as if hereby he had shone honour to the lion, who stood so immovably upon the fountain that I took him to be stone or brass, but who immediately took the naked sword which he bare in his paw, brake it into 2 in the middle, the 2 pieces whereof sunk into the fountain, after which he so long reared until a white dove brought a branch of olive in her bill, which the lion devoured in an instant, and so was quieted. The unicorn returned to his place with joy, while our virgin led us down by the winding stairs from the scaffold, and so we again made our reverence towards the curtain. We washed our hands and heads in the fountain, and whereby waited in order till the king through a secret gallery returned into his hall, and then we also, with choice music, pomp, state, and a pleasant discourse, were conducted into our former lodging. Here, that the time might not seem too long to us, the Virgin bestowed on each of us a noble page, not only richly habited, but also exceedingly learned, and able aptly to discourse on all subjects, so that we had reason to be ashamed of ourselves. These were commanded to lead us up and down the castle, yet only in certain places, and if possible, to shorten the time according to our desire. Meantime, the Virgin took leave, promising to be with us again at supper, and after to celebrate the ceremonies of hanging up the weights. while on the morrow we should be presented to the king. Each of us now did what best pleased him, one part viewing the excellent paintings which they copied for themselves and considered what the wonderful characters might signify, others recruiting themselves with meat and drink. I caused my page to conduct me, with my companion, up and down the castle, of which walk it will never repent me so long as I live. Besides many other glorious antiquities, the royal sepulchre was showed to me, by which I learned more than is extant in all books. There in the same place stands the glorious phoenix, of which 2 years since I published a small discourse, and am resolved, in case this narrative prove useful, to set forth several treatises concerning the lion, eagle, griffin, falcon, etc., together with their draughts and inscriptions. It grieves me also for my other consorts that they neglected such precious treasures. I indeed reaped the most benefit by my page, for according as such each one's genius lay, so he led his entrusted one into the quarters pleasing to him. Now the keys hereunto belonging were committed to my page, and therefore this good fortune happened to me before the rest. For though he invited others to come in, yet they, imagining such tombs to be only in the churchyard, thought they should well enough be thither, and whenever anything was to be seen there. Neither shall these monuments be withheld from my thankful scholars. The other thing that was showed to us was the noble library, as it was altogether before the Reformation, of which I have so much the less to say, because the catalogue is shortly to be published. At the entry of this room stands a great book, the like whereof I never saw, in which all the figures, rooms, portals, writings, riddles, and the like to be seen in the whole castle are delineated. In every book stands its author painted, whereof many were to be burnt, that even their memory might be blotted out from amongst the righteous. Having taken a full view, and being scarce gotten forth, there comes another page, and having whispered somewhat in our page's ear, he delivered up the keys to him, who immediately carried them up the winding stairs. But our page was very much out of countenance, and we, setting hard upon him with entreaties, he declared to us that the King's Majesty would by no means permit that either the library or sepulchres should be seen by man, and he besought us as we tendered his life to discover it not to anyone, he having already utterly denied it, whereupon both of us stood hovering between joy and fear, yet it continued in silence, and no man made further inquiry about it. Thus, in both places, we consumed 3 hours, and now, although it had struck 7, nothing was hitherto given us to eat, but our hunger was abated by constant revivings, and I could be content to fast all my life with such an entertainment. About this time, the curious fountains, mines, and all kind of art shops were also known to us, of which there was none but surpassed all our arts, even if melted into one mass. Every chamber was built in semicircle, that so they might have before their eyes the costly clockwork which was erected upon a fair turret in the centre, and regulate themselves according to the course of the planets, which were to be seen on it in a glorious manner. At length I came into a spacious room, in the middle whereof stood a terrestrial globe, whose diameter contained 30 foot, albeit near half, except a little which was covered with the steps was let into the earth. 2 men might readily turn it about, so that more of it was never to be seen but so much as was above the horizon. I could not understand whereto those ringlets of gold, which were upon it in several places, served, at which my page laughed, and advised me to view them more narrowly. When I found that my native country noted with gold also, whereupon my companion sought his and found that too. The same happened to others who stood by, and the page told us that it was yesterday declared that the King's Majesty, by their old astronomer Atlas, that all the gilded points did exactly answer to their native countries, and therefore he, as soon as he perceived that I undervalued myself, but that nevertheless there stood a point upon my native country, moved one of the captains to entreat for us to be set upon the scale at all adventures, especially seeing one of our native countries had a notable good mark. And truly, it was not without cause that he, the page of greatest power, was bestowed on me. For this I returned him thanks, and looking more diligently upon my native country, I found that, besides the ringlets, there was also certain delicate streaks upon it. I saw much more even upon this globe than I am willing to discover. Let each man take into consideration why every city produces not a philosopher. After this, he led us within the globe, for on the sea there was a tablet, whereon stood 3 dedications and the author's name, which a man might gently lift up, and by a little board go into the centre, which was capable of 4 persons, being nothing but a round board whereon we could sit, and at ease by broad daylight, it was now already dark, contemplate the stars, which seemed like mere carbuncles glittering in an agreeable order, and moving so gallantly that I had scarce any mind ever to go out again. As the page afterwards told the Virgin, and with which she often twitted me, for it was already supper time, and I was almost the last at table, the waiters treated me with so much reverence and honour that for shame I durst not look up. To speak concerning the music or the rest of the magnificent entertainment I hold needless, because it is not possible sufficiently to express it. In brief, there was nothing there but art and amenity. After we had each to other related our employment since noon, howbeit not a word was spoken of the library and monuments, being already merry with wine, the Virgin began thus: My lords, I have a great contention with one of my sisters. In our chamber we have an eagle, whom we cherish with such diligence that each of us is desirous to be the best loved, and upon that score have many a squabble. On a day we concluded to go both together to him, and toward whom he should show himself most friendly, hers should he be properly be. This we did, and I, as commonly, bear in my hand a branch of laurel, but my sister had none. As soon as he espied us both, he gave my sister another branch which he had in his beak, and offered at mine, which I gave to him. Each of us hereupon imagined herself best beloved of him. Which way am I to resolve myself? This modest proposal pleased us mightily well, and each one would gladly have heard the solution, but inasmuch as all looked upon me, and desired to have the beginning from me, my mind was so extremely confounded that I knew not what to do but propound another in its stead, and said, therefore, Gracious lady, your ladyship's questions were easily to be resolved if one thing did not perplex me. I had 2 companions, who both loved me exceedingly, they being doubtfully which was most dear to me, concluded to run to me unawares, and that he whom I should then embrace should be the right. This they did, yet one of them could not keep pace with the other, so he stayed behind and wept, the other I embraced with amazement. When they had afterwards discovered the business to me, I knew not how to resolve, and have hitherto let it rest in this manner till I may find some good advice herein. The Virgin wondered at it, and well observed whereabout I was, upon which she replied that we should both be quit, and then desired the solution from the rest. But I had already made them wise, wherefore the next began thus. In my city a virgin was condemned to death, but the judge, being pitiful towards her, proclaimed that if any man desired to be her champion, he should have free leave. Now she had 2 lovers, one made himself ready, and came into the lists to expect his adversary. Afterwards the other presented himself, but coming too late, resolved nevertheless to fight, and suffer himself to be vanquished, that the virgin's life might be preserved, which succeeded accordingly. Thereupon each challenged her, and now, my lords, instruct me to which of them of right she belongeth. The Virgin could hold no longer, but said, I thought to have gained much information, and am myself gotten into the net. Yet I would gladly hear whether there be any more behind. Yes, that there is, answered the third. A stranger adventure has not been recounted than that which happened to myself. In my youth I loved a worthy maid, and that my love might attain its end, I made use of an ancient matron, who easily brought me to her. Now it happened that the maid's brethren came in upon us as we three were together, and were in such a rage that they could not have taken my life, but, on my vehement supplication, they at length forced me to swear to take each of them for a year to my wedded wife. Now, tell me, my lords, should I take the old or the young one first? We all laughed sufficiently at this riddle, yet none would undertake to unfold it, and the fourth began. In a certain city there dwelt an honourable lady, beloved of all, but especially of a young noble man, who would needs to be importunate with her. At length she gave him this determination, that in case he would, in a cold winter, lead her into a fair green garden of roses, then he should obtain, but if not he must resolve never to see her more. The nobleman travelled into all countries to find one who might perform this, till at length he light upon a little old man who promised to do it for him, in case he would assure him of half his estate, which he, having consented to the other, was as good as his word. Whereupon he invited the lady home to his garden, where, contrary to her expectation, she found all things green, pleasant, and warm, and remembering her promise, she only requested that she might once more return to her lord, to whom with sighs and tears she bewailed her lamentable condition. Her lord, sufficiently perceived her faithfulness, dispatched her back to her lover, who had so dearly purchased her, that she might give him satisfaction, when the husband's integrity so mightily affected the nobleman that he thought it a sin to touch so honest a wife, and sent her home with honour to her lord. The little man, perceiving such faith in all these, would not, how poor soever he were, be the least, but restored the nobleman all his goods, and went his way. Now, my lords, which of these persons showed the greatest ingenuity? Here our tongues were quite cut off, neither would the virgin make any reply, but that another should go on, wherefore the fifth began. I desire not to make long work. Who has the greater joy, he that beholds what he loves, or he that only thinks on it? He that beholdeth it, said the virgin. Nay, answered I, and whereupon rose a contest till the sixth called out, My lords, I am to take a wife. I have before me a maid, a married wife, and a widow. Ease me of this doubt, and I will help to order the rest. It goes well there, replied the seventh, when a man has his choice, but with me the case is otherwise. In my youth I loved a fair and virtuous virgin, and she me in like manner. Howbeit, because of her friend's denial, we could not come together in wedlock, whereupon she was married to another, who maintained her honourably and with affection, till she came into the pains of childbirth, which went so hard with her that all thought she was dead. So with much state and mourning she was interred. Now I thought with myself during her life, you could have no part in this woman, but dead as she is, you may embrace her sufficiently. Whereupon I took my servant with me, who dug her up by night. Having opened the coffin and locked her in my arms, I found some little motion in her heart, which increased from my warmth, till I perceived she was indeed alive. I quietly bore her home, and after I had warmed her chilled body with a costly bath of herbs, I committed her to my mother until she brought forth a fair son, whom I caused faithfully to be nursed. After 2 days, she being in a mighty amazement, I discovered to her all the affair, requesting that for the time to come she would live with me as a wife, against which she expected thus, in case it should be grievous to her husband, who had maintained her well and honourably, but if it could otherwise be, she was the present obliged in love to one as well as another. After 2 months, being then to make a journey elsewhere, I invited her husband as a guest, and amongst other things demanded of him whether it was his deceased wife could come home again, he could be content to receive her, and he, affirming it with tears and lamentations, I brought him his wife and son, recounting all the forepast business, and entreating him to ratify with his consent my 4 proposed espousals. After a long dispute, he could not beat me from my right, but was fain to leave me the wife. But still the contest was about the son. Here the Virgin interrupted him and said, "It makes me wonder how you could double the afflicted man's grief." Upon this there arose a dispute amongst us, the most part affirming he had done but right. "Nay," said he, "I freely returned him both his wife and son. Now tell me, my lords, was my honesty or this man's joy the greater?" These words so mightily cheered the Virgin that she caused her health to go round. After which, other proposals went on somewhat perplexedly, so that I could not retain them all. Yet this comes to my mind that one told how a few years before he had seen a physician who brought a parcel of wood against winter, with which he warmed himself all winter long. But as soon as spring returned, he sold the very same wood again, and so had the use of it for nothing. "Here must needs be skill," said the Virgin, "but the time is now past." "Yea," replied my companion, "whoever understands how to resolve all the riddles may give notice of it by a proper messenger. I conceive he will not be denied." At this time they began to say grace, and we arose all together from the table, rather satisfied and merry than glutted. It were to be wished that all invitations and feastings were thus kept. Having taken some few turns up and down the hall, the Virgin asked us whether we desired to begin the wedding. "Yes," said one, "noble and virtuous lady," whereupon she privately dispatched a page, and meantime proceeded in discourse with us. In brief, she was become so familiar that I had ventured and requested her name. The Virgin smiled at my curiosity and replied, "My name contains 55, and yet has only 8 letters. The third is the third part of the 5th, which added to the 6th will produce a number, whose root shall exceed the third itself by just the first, and it is the half of the 4th. Now the 5th and 7th are equal, the last and first are also equal, and make with the second as much as the 6th has, which contains 4 more than the third tripled. Now tell me, my lord, how am I called?" The answer was intricate enough, yet I left not off, but said, "Noble and virtuous lady, may I not obtain one only letter?" "Yea," she said, "that may well be done." "What then," I proceeded, "may the 7th contain?" "It contains," said she, "as many as there are lords here." With this I easily found her name, at which she was well pleased, saying that much more should yet be revealed to us. Meantime, certain virgins had made themselves ready, and came in with great ceremony. 2 youths carried lights before them, one of whom was jocund countenance, sprightly eyed, and gentile proportion, while the other looked something angry, and somewhat he would have must be, as I afterwards perceived. 4 virgins followed them. One looked shamefully towards the earth. The second also was a modest, bashful virgin. The third, as she entered, seemed amazed at somewhat, and, as I understood, she cannot well abide where there is too much mirth. The 4th brought with her certain small wreaths, to manifest her kindness and liberality. After these 4 came 2 somewhat more gloriously apparelled. They saluted us courteously. One of them had a gown of sky colour, spangled with golden stars. The other's was green, beautified with red and white stripes. On their heads they had thin flying white tiffities, which did most becomingly adorn them. At last came one alone, wearing a coronet, and rather looking up towards heaven than towards earth. We all took her for the bride, but were much mistaken, although in honour, riches, and state she much surpassed the bride, and afterwards ruled the whole wedding. On this occasion we all followed our Virgin, and fell on our knees. Howbeit she showed herself extremely humble, offering each her hand, and admonishing us not to be too much surprised at this, which was one of her smallest bounties, but to lift up our eyes to our Creator, and acknowledge his omnipotence, and so proceed in our enterprised course, employing this grace to the praise of God and the good of man. In sum, her words were quite different from those of our Virgin, who was somewhat more worldly. They pierced even through my bones and marrow. "Thou," she said further to me, "hast received more than others. See that thou also make a larger return." This to me was a very strange sermon, for as soon as we saw the virgins with the music, we imagined we should fall to dancing. Now the waits stood still in the same place, wherefore the queen, I yet not knew who she was, commanded each virgin to take up one, but to our virgin she gave her own, which was the largest, and commanded us to follow behind. Our majesty was then somewhat abated, for I observed that our virgin was but too good for us, and that we were not too highly reputed as we ourselves were almost willing to fancy. We were brought into the first chamber, where our virgin hung the queen's weight, during which an excellent spiritual hymn was sung. There was nothing costly in this room save certain curious little prayer books, which should never be missing. In the midst was a pulpit, convenient for prayer, wherein the queen kneeled down, and about her we also were keen to kneel and pray after the Virgin, who read out of a book, that this wedding might tend to the honour of God and our own benefit. We then came into the second chamber, where the first virgin hung up her weight also, and so forward till all the ceremonies were finished. Upon which the queen again presented her hand to every one, and departed with her virgins. Our president stayed a while with us, but because it had already been 2 hours night, she would then no longer detain us, and, though methought she was glad of our company, she bid us good night, wishing us quiet rest. Our pages were well instructed, and showed every man his chamber, stayed with us in another pallet in case we wanted anything. My chamber was royally furnished, with rare tapestries and hung about with paintings, but above all things I was delighted in my page, who was so excellently spoken and experienced in the arts, that he yet spent another hour, and it was half an hour after 3 when I fell asleep. This was the first night that I slept in quiet, and yet a scurvy dream would not suffer me to rest, for I was troubled with a door which I could not get open, though at last I did so. With these fantasies I passed the time, till at length towards day I awakened.